Hello, I'm P.J Roscoe, and today I'm reading a chapter from the author Ellen Reid, her book The Feathered Nest. Cheers. They'd eaten breakfast early because word had reached the captain that the lighters would be alongside at 8 o'clock. Alexandra didn't feel like eating anything more than toast, and she noticed that the same applied to her family. Jane Beard managed a hearty meal. Alexandra guessed Jane would be used to field trips with her brother, where breakfast was, indeed, the most important meal of the day. Alexandra couldn't cope with a full stomach and the thought of the grueling crossing to come. Out on deck, Alexandra glanced at the blue sky with hardly a cloud in sight. Salt air filled her nostrils. Gulls flew around their yacht. She hoped their little trip would be done with ease, and yet her stomach still lurched. Or was it the yacht that moved beneath her feet? This morning she took more notice of the many stone buildings, some nothing more than the ruins of walls that had once been the convict settlement. The verdant land sloped upwards from the bay to where a row of other buildings had once been houses to the military. Some of these looked in disrepair too. Her father had mentioned over breakfast that these houses had also once been occupied by Pitcairners after they came to Norfolk Island. The tall, majestic Norfolk pine trees grew all over Kingston and beyond the settlement. To the right of Kingston, Alexandra glimpsed another small, tranquil bay. They could explore it later, once they were settled. To the left rose high, rugged cliffs, which seemed to stretch out of view. "It's no wonder there isn't a harbour," Benedict said, reading her thoughts. "I know, darling. A reef here before us and impossible cliffs there." "I understand the entire island is the same," her father said. "In my book," Edith said as she struggled to turn to the correct page, "it says there is another bay, Cascade Bay, on the other side of the island, where ships can anchor, but still with no real harbour, although it has a whaling station." "That would be interesting to see," her father said. "Whaling!" Alexandra exclaimed. "Surely people don't still kill whales for their oil? Oh, how appalling!" "Whale oil and blubber are still used for many things, my darling." Alexandra felt uncomfortable at the thought. Did she live too privileged a life that she'd lost sight of what still happened in the world, to its birds, its animals? Perhaps this expedition would prove to be an eye-opener for her. They walked to the other side of the yacht and took in the sight of two other islands, one quite small, Nepean Island on their left, and the larger Phillip Island to the right, so the captain had told them. "I wonder if we can visit those islands while we're here, Daddy?" "Perhaps we'll have to inquire." "Phillip Island has the most striking colours, such rich reds and purples, even greys and soft yellows." "I believe from my research," Jane Beard said, "that Phillip Island was once a haven for many birds, but they were decimated by feral pigs the convict authorities in their wisdom decided to put there." "How awful!" Alexandra replied. "I can't see us climbing Phillip Island's cliffs," Benedict said. "You're probably right, darling. Just a passing thought." Before long, two lighters were rowed out to the yacht, with 4 men on 4 oars in each. The men wore trousers, boots and shirts without any collars and sleeves rolled up above their elbows. Not a slick of brilliantine in sight. Even though the rowboats weren't too large, Alexandra marvelled at how they negotiated the waves crashing onto the reef. Her second thought, that they had to travel in the boats back over the reef, troubled her far more. She wished she'd suggested to Eddie that they wear their trousers, boots, and a long blouse this morning. Alexandra noticed that Jane had been more sensible and wore trousers and boots with a long shirt. Somehow, on Jane, the attire looked more masculine than Alexandra's and Eddie's did on them. In any case, she couldn't change her clothes now. Sylvie had everything packed and ready to be transferred to the lighters. The men in the boats threw up rope and those on deck tied the lighters to the yacht. It still looked precarious with waves rolling the yacht under their feet. When Alexandra looked over the side of the yacht at the rope ladder with timber steps they had to climb down, her stomach did a flip. "We should have worn more sensible shoes, Eddie." She glanced back over her shoulder to see Edith's hazel eyes wide beneath her cloth hat. "Let me go first, my love," Benedict said. "I can then help you down." A gate in the railing had been opened, which, in normal circumstances, would have allowed a gangplank to be lowered. Benedict stepped through the gate and climbed down the ladder. One of the men in the lighter helped Benedict negotiate the final step, which was more of a leap into the boat. "How on earth are we to do that, Lexi?" Edith's small voice sounded next to her ear. "Benedict will help us, darling," Alexandra replied, trying to sound confident. "Me next!" Alexandra hooked her handbag over her arm. How absurd! Why didn't she think and pack her handbag with the rest of her belongings? Now high heels had to manage this precarious ladder. If only everything would keep still. On the first rung her heel nearly caught. She hoped her dress didn't allow for anyone to see up her skirt. When she almost slipped, she gave herself a mental shake and concentrated on what she was doing. At last, after what seemed an age, she teetered on the final rung and turned her head to look into her husband's brown eyes. How on earth was she going to manage the jump into the boat? Benedict came closer to the ladder. "Just turn, darling, and put your foot on the edge of the boat. I'll guide you." Alexandra glanced at the four men behind Benedict, aware of their curious eyes. They probably thought this whole thing entertaining. She raised her chin, took the step, and jumped down into Benedict's arms. "That's it," he said. "You sit down, my love, while I help Edie." Alexandra cast uncertain eyes over the boat. Wooden slats of timber passed as seats. They didn't look particularly clean. Why hadn't they changed into more suitable attire? The boat swayed as she took a step. A hand shot out to steady her. Benedict had turned to help Edie, so she accepted the assistance. Then she glanced up at the man. Black eyes beneath a mop of curly black hair laughed at her. A grin flashed white teeth. "Sit down here, princess," he said, and helped her walk to one of the seats. Before Alexandra could sit down, the boat and the yacht too lurched on the swell of a wave. It threw her off balance and against the man's chest. His arms went around her to steady her. He smelled of the sea. It made Alexandra think of their days on the endless summer, when the warm sea breeze found them on deck and soothed their spirits. Then Alexandra looked up, and he grinned at her. She pushed back from him. "Get your hands off me," Alexandra demanded, and frowned at him. "I'm a married woman." "Lucky bloke," he grinned again. His laughing eyes sparked something in Alexandra. Anger coursed through her blood. When the boat lurched again and he put out a helping hand, she slapped it away. "Just trying to help, Princess." "Don't call me that. I'm not a princess." "My mistake." He grinned again as she flopped onto the bench seat. Alexandra wrinkled her nose at the strong smell of fish. Edith stood on the deck of the boat. She now had to negotiate the same difficulties. Benedict had turned to help Sylvie, who looked terrified as she took her first step onto the ladder. The man, the sailor, did the same with Edith. He grabbed Edie's arm when she stumbled and helped her to a seat. Only when he grinned at Edith, her eyes glazed over. Alexandra dug her in the ribs. Her father came after Sylvie, then Harry, who'd been given the task to carry Bella. One of the other sailors took Bella while Harry leapt into the boat and then gave her back to him. Bella licked Edith's face and then cuddled up to her. Jane and Joseph Beard, along with Tommy Spriggs, had gone through the same ordeal of getting into the other rowboat. They, however, managed it better. After all, Jane had worn sensible clothes and shoes, and was probably used to adventures with her brother. Once all the luggage and equipment had been loaded, shared across the two lighters, the crew on deck untied the ropes to free the rowboats. The islanders sat behind their oars and cut them through the water, their backs bent and muscles strained. Edith grabbed Alexander's hand as the lighters passed over the reef. The waves carried them across. The yacht's captain had mentioned it would be nearly low tide when they crossed, telling them that it would be much rougher at high tide. Alexandra supposed they had to be grateful for small mercies. Once the rowboats had passed over the reefs and large rocks showing beneath the water, the boats eased into the calm bay before Kingston. The lighters headed towards a long pier. Edith groaned. "My thoughts exactly, Edie," Alexandra said. "Now we have to get out of this thing and onto land." Concrete steps descending from the side of the pier became visible as the men rowed closer to it. The lighter hit the side of the wharf. The sailors threw up ropes, and men on the wharf tied them to some unseen bollard. "I'll go first again," Benedict said. "I'll go, mate," the curly-haired sailor said. "Best if I'm out first to help you step across. It's not easy." "Thank you, Benedict looked questioningly at the sailor. "Scrimshaw." "Benedict Archer." Benedict put out a hand. The man, Scrimshaw, shook it before he jumped out of the boat and onto the steps as if his legs had springs. Benedict followed Scrimshaw. What sort of a name was that? Then Alexandra stood up and stared at the bottom jetty step. It went up and down before her eyes. No, she went up and down as the boat swayed. One of the other sailors, a tall, solid man with dark brown wavy hair and eyes that gave him something of the look of a Polynesian, reached out a hand to assist Alexandra. After Scrimshaw's insolence, she looked uncertainly at it. "James Clegg, ma'am," he said in a rich, friendly voice. "Clegg?" Alexandra's eyes shot open. "You're related to James Clegg, the bounty mutineer." "That I am. Everyone calls me Tiny." "Tiny?" Alexandra stared up at the big man. "Come on, Princess," Scrimshaw called. "No time for chitty-chat now." Alexandra smiled at Tiny, then glared at Scrimshaw before stepping onto the boat's gunwale. Scrimshaw grabbed her hand and helped her across, and then onto the bottom of the concrete steps. She would have refused his help, but she'd needed it to reach the stairs. The steps didn't have a handrail, so Scrimshaw helped her get past him to a point where she could clutch her husband's outstretched hand. Benedict guided her up the remainder of the steps to the wharf above. He went back to help Edie. Once her father stood beside her, a man who'd been standing next to a car parked along the long pier came towards them. "Mr. Thornton?" he asked. When Thomas nodded, he added, "I'm Daniel Clark, but everyone here calls me Paw Paw." Alexandra did a double take. Who would call a man Paw Paw? He looked to be in his mid-30s, of average height and build, with blonde hair and pale grey eyes. He gave a hint of a smile as he shook Thomas's hand. "I'm head gardener and general handyman at Government House. I've been sent to drive you." He nodded his head to indicate the car. "We have a truck to carry the luggage and your equipment too." "That's very good of you," Thomas said. When Benedict joined them with Edith and Bella, Sylvie and Harry, her father went through the introductions, which he repeated when the birds alighted from their boat. "Righto," Paw Paw said. "We might have to make 2 trips. It's not far, though. I'll come back for the rest of you. Fred and the boys will bring the luggage." As they all followed Paw Paw, Alexandra supposed they would discover the identity of Fred and the boys, and what amazing nicknames they might possess. Benedict insisted her father should go with Alexandra and Edith on the first drive to Government House. "I'll wait for the car to return. It's best your father is there to meet whoever is there." Alexandra kissed her husband and then slipped into the back seat of the open-sided Model T Ford. Its black exterior carried no adornments, such as carriage lights. Her father had told her Henry Ford wanted to make an affordable and usable car that everyone could drive. Doctors in particular found the Model Ts more convenient than having to hitch horses to a post and water and feed them. How unexpected to see one here! Alexandra often saw them in Melbourne. They had been imported some years ago and were assembled in Australia. As Paw Paw had told them, the journey to Government House took hardly any time at all. Though still in Kingston, the mansion sat on the other side of the ruined convict settlement, surrounded by green lawns and overlooking Emily Bay. So Paw Paw told them. It was the peaceful bay Alexandra had spied while still on the yacht. Paw Paw drove through a gateway in a low timber fence that looked as if it surrounded the property. The long one-story house appeared to be built of stone. A roof, supported by white pillars, covered the wide veranda.